Hello, I'm Zoë Grünewald, and you're listening to the New Statesman's twice-weekly politics podcast. In this episode, I'm very lucky to be joined by not one but two special guests. We've got writer and commentator Benedict Spence and chief executive of the Liberal Conservative think tank Ryan Shorthouse. Today, we'll be discussing the past, present and future of moderate conservatism and what the Conservative Party could look like at the next general election. Unless you guys have been living under a rock, it feels like the news at the minute has been kind of overwhelmingly concerned with the right of the Conservative Party. So whether it's kind of immigration, the National Conservatives Conference, culture wars, we seem to be just hearing a lot from the voices on the right, but also a lot about what the right's talking about and what the right looks like. Ryan, I'd like to start with you. Is this just noise, or are we actually seeing a genuine shift to the right being kind of the most powerful part of British politics?
Well, in a way, I think it's a good thing that the Conservative Party and the wider Conservative movement are having all these conferences. It shows like a lot of intellectual vitality and debate. And I don't really see much of that on the left, to be honest. What I would say is I think particularly since Brexit, there has been a focus on a particular type of voter, the sort of so-called red wall voter, which is perceived to be a little bit older, a little bit more socially conservative, a little bit left on the economy, wants a bit more security. And I think both the Conservatives and Labour have focused on that sort of typical, what they see to be typical red wall voter. My own view is that the vote for Brexit and then the majority that came for the Tories in 2019 has been somewhat overinterpreted. I think, people decided to vote to leave the European Union because they just didn't like it. This sort of idea that there's a sort of big backlash from people in so-called left-behind areas who just felt so aggrieved by the establishment. I mean, what happened between 2015 and 2016? In 2015, the majority of people voted for the Tory party to continue their austerity programme. And then the next year, apparently, there's sort of cries of, this is terrible, the establishment have let us down. So I think that's been somewhat exaggerated. And then the vote for Boris, the sort of so-called saviour of left behind Britain, I think a large part of it was just to do with the radicalism of Jeremy Corbyn. So that's me going kind of quite a long way around, basically saying I think the parties have focused a lot more on what they consider to be a kind of typical red wall voter, which is sort of more socially conservative, bit more economically left-wing. I think some of that has been overinterpreted. And actually for the Tories in particular, I think a lot of those voters are not people who are left behind, but actually quite aspirational. There's lots of evidence that those red wall seats that went Tory had a lot more homeowners. And of course, they're probably now feeling a lot more pain because of interest rate rises. A lot of them, are relying on cars on finance and having houses with mortgages. And that's been quite heavily impacted. So I think that's playing into a lot of frustrations now with the Tory party.
Yeah, because we've seen, MPs like Lee Anderson, for example, who's, the kind of red wall Rottweiler, so he's nicknamed. And there's this kind of idea that in some way he, speaks for the red wall or represents the red wall. But I guess you're kind of saying that's a bit of an overinterpretation of just a huge, number of people in the north of England almost, because obviously there's varying kind of political allegiances across the country. Benedict, do you agree? Do you think, it's a kind of overinterpretation of what that kind of group wants to see from politics?
To a degree. I think the right is going through something of a crisis. It's fighting a war with itself that many people thought Brexit would solve, and it didn't. It just reopened divides that weren't actually at the top of the agenda. And I think a lot of that is down actually to the competence of politicians and of government. One of the things that I think is very interesting from the National Conservative Conference, the much lambasted National Conservative Conference, was the sort of the howls of indignation from many Conservatives. You've had 13 years to do all of this. Why haven't you done anything? And it's actually very difficult to take anything away from that other than that it is the truth. If you wanted to sort of radically change the way that the country was going, if you wanted to fix many of the issues that are currently coming home to roost, they could have done so. These were not secrets. They were simply things that they didn't think were opportune, were politically savvy, because it was all about interpreting what different demographics want. Ultimately, what it comes down to is people want competence. And I think one of the things that we missed from the vote for Brexit, It was in part because of immigration. We can't really move away from that. I know lots of people want to say that it isn't, but it was. But that in itself was because people perceived their government as not being competent. Actually, it was a vote championed by the Tories, but it was very much a vote against the Tories because it was against the establishment. No Tory is more pro-Europe. No party is more pro-Europe than the Tories have been historically, as well as being the one that sort of leads the charge against it. That is what it was. And what we have revealed, take back control, was about getting a government that actually had a sense of a grip of things. The direction that we're going in terms of economics, in terms of energy policy, in terms of education. These were the great unspoken things, but I think they were all sort of simmering there because, we go back to Cameron and discussions about broken Britain and hug a hoodie and all that. The sort of the fraying of the social contract was already there for everybody to see. And there was this idea that Brexit would solve all of this. Well, if you have a party that doesn't actually have a clear vision beyond business as usual after you leave the European Union, well, how can you possibly hope to solve any of that? And, it's done this very, this very dramatic thing in leaving the European Union and then gone, oh, what do we do now? I thought everything would have been solved by now. So I think a lot of what this is the multitude of different factions and different people who have different ideas are all sort of coming together and realizing we don't have that much in common. It's very difficult to look at a party with, say, somebody like Bill Cash on one side and somebody like Caroline Noakes on the other. And I know many have already left. The Anna Soubries of this world have already left the Tory party over Brexit. But, plenty of them are still in there. And a lot of these are sort of natural Conservative voters who we now see beginning once again that migration towards the Greens or the Lib Dems, and in the case of Red Wall voters, potentially back to the Labour Party. And the Tories are running around going, well, Brexit was supposed to solve all of this. We thought that this was the silver bullet. It was supposed to be fantastic. Never actually getting to grips with the reason why people voted for it. There was an understanding, a recognition that the people who are currently in charge should not have been in charge. They are not doing their jobs as people want them to be done. And it's a very difficult conversation in the Tory party because it means addressing some slightly difficult questions around things like immigration that they don't want to say out loud, but they are going to have to. Otherwise, it's long-term electoral oblivion.
There's kind of been this conflation, I guess, a bit when we talk about right-wing conservatism of kind of, there's obviously the socially conservative element, which we saw quite a lot of at NatCon, maybe views on kind of marriage or LGBT issues or immigration. And then there's also the kind of small statist conservatives who have also been called, right-wing. But sometimes, there are members who hold conflicting views on these things. I'm thinking, for example, like Steve Baker, who is very small statist. He would describe himself as economically liberal, but he has quite progressive views on LGBT issues. And Black Lives Matter and things like that. Is there some kind of sort of defining issue that we can say is kind of right-wing conservatism? Or are we at the minute kind of just using it as an all-encompassing term for, sort of varying views in the Conservative Party?
I think it is in danger of becoming, an all-encompassing view and often a sort of term of abuse. I would say there's probably two spectrums broadly. I mean, there's lots of different pressure groups and think tanks and individuals who represent different parts of the centre-right. But I would say there's broadly two spectrums. The one is on economic grounds and the sort of role of the state. And you go from the kind of libertarians, and Liz Truss obviously had her day, or a few days. And then you've got the more kind of statist, interventionist, Theresa May, the good that government can do. And then the other spectrum, I think, is on more cultural issues. And, you have the more kind of communitarians who are concerned about the social fabric, about the traditional family. Danny Kruger is probably in there. I would also perhaps put Rishi Sunak in that as well. And then you've got the more kind of culturally permissive, liberal, which Cameron sort of represented, pro-gay rights, pro-diversity, that sort of agenda. And they're the two spectrums to which different people are sitting. My own view of Rishi is that he's got the kind of vibe of somebody who's a bit like Cameron, quite liberal, young, modern, but actually is definitely more right-wing, certainly culturally, and I would say economically, instinctively, even though at the moment the size of the state in terms of the amount of debt we have and the taxation burden is quite high. His instinct, I think, is much more right-wing economically. And it is quite ironic, really, because all of these, the Conservative Democratic organisation that did that conference, who have really sort of big Boris cheerleaders, and a lot of them are on the right. Well, Boris is one of the most left-wing Tory prime ministers we've had in a long time. Very fiscally expansionist, very permissive about immigration, hence why we've got quite high numbers at the moment. Very pro on the environment. Rishi is much more right-wing, but a lot of these people seem to think that he's a sort of establishment Europhile, which shows the sort of confusion that there is. But I think Benedict is right, which is, all because things are not going well, we're getting more divisiveness on the right. And, a lot of centrist Tories who worry about speaking out and are less vocal, they're less provocative. That's just how they think in terms of policy, but their style as well. And for a long time, they've been in government and, really they've had the prime minister that they want, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson to a certain extent. Whereas I think the jury's still out on Rishi. Like the vibe is one of kind of liberalism, but the actual substance, I think, is much more culturally conservative. And I think a lot of centrist conservatives just see what happened in 2022, the amount of division, the impact that had on the party's reputation, and don't want to stoke the fire even more. So just, they just think it can't go as low as it is now. So what's the point in going all guns blazing for Rishi on some things which they're uncomfortable about? For example, the asylum reforms, also kind of threats to come out of the European Convention.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because when we talk about the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, people always say, Sunak had to keep her in to appease the right of his party. But, in some ways he is the right of his party. So it's like, is there an even more kind of right, part of the party than Sunak? Or, what is the group there? I mean, Benedict, maybe you can answer that.
I mean, there are certainly elements to the right of Rishi Sunak. There's no question about that. I think that we very often sort of paint people like Suella Braverman and before her Priti Patel as these almost sort of demonic figures, or they certainly are painted by certain people on the left, and they're very easy to do that, and that's why they're in those positions that act as human flak jackets for the Prime Minister, especially one who wants to sort of position himself as somebody who is fairly centrist but is also quite right-wing. It's very helpful to have that little puppet slightly further in that direction. As to whether or not you can get even further to the right, yeah, that's absolutely possible. And again, I think you're beginning to see shoots of it at conferences like the National Conservatism Conference. Now, a lot of people sort of, will sort of clutch their pearls and go, oh, the far right is on the march again. And it's not really about that at all. It is a sort of an importation of a lot of, I'd say, very American and also Israeli values, right-wing values, things like pronatal policies, things like the nuclear family. The expression ethno-nationalism, you hear it a lot more nowadays in sort of conjunction with immigration, and it's not a nice thing to sort of think about. But that is certainly, they like to compare countries like the UK to countries like Japan or Italy, for example, and say, well, what are those countries doing well that we aren't doing here? And they go, well, that's because you've got this sort of homogenous community and everybody sort of pulls together and they all work. And that's certainly growing. I wouldn't say that it's a major factor at the moment, but amongst what interests me is younger people. A lot of younger people are certainly sort of taking these positions that you just don't imagine. You'd think that would sort of be the preserve of the greying older voters, so that they got more sort of bitter and right wing. But actually, no, that's coming a lot more. You see it a lot more online. I don't think that that's going to be on the agenda anytime soon. I also think that the party is large enough and sort of muddled enough to sort of drown a lot of that out. But make no mistake that intolerance towards immigration, I think, is certainly growing. And a lot of that comes because the government hasn't been honest, actually, about what immigration is, why it is necessary. It hasn't really been very honest about its plans if we are to sort of stop it or reduce it and what would replace it. So it's in those sort of the vacuum of clarity, you will get people who are, I wouldn't like to say extremists. I'd say very deep into sort of very theoretical realms of what the world is like. People, it's one of the things that you might spot about the National Conservative Conference. A lot of very intelligent people who I don't think get out very much, don't speak to ordinary people. They have these sort of grand visions of what the world is like, and it's very different. It's a nice theory, but it is very different from reality. And that is what the party just needs to, the disinfectant of light and honesty about what your plans are to deal with the issues. And at the moment, we don't really have that. We've got Rishi Sunak saying, oh, yes, immigration is too high. The 2019 manifesto said, we're going to bring it down. But I'm not going to bring it down to those kind of levels. I'm going to bring it down to the levels that I inherited. So 500,000 rather than 600,000. Then I can turn around and say, I'm bringing down immigration. And a lot of people will turn around and go, well, we can see what you're doing there. You're not being honest with us. You don't have a long-term solution to labour shortages in this country. Can you give us that? And I think, as you say, you're right. There's a sort of a lack of bravery, if you like, from the centrists to say, no, this is our plan, this is what we believe, this is how we plan to get out of this. There's a lot of hand-wringing and trying to put out fires, some of which aren't particularly big and don't need to be put out just yet.
I mean, I just to kind of agree and disagree in sort of centrist dad fashion with what Benedict is saying. On immigration, I mean, I certainly think on the right there is a lot of anxiety about a lack of grip, saying one thing and then the opposite completely happening. I think more widely, my understanding of public attitudes on immigration is that it's become a lot softer towards immigration since the Brexit vote. Whether the vote for the referendum, there was a sort of sense we have more control now, whereas we had free movement before, I don't know. But generally, public attitudes towards immigration have become softer. That might be turning a little bit with what's happening in terms of the small boat arrivals. But I would say this goes to a wider point about young people, which is, the sort of theory of some kind of national conservatives or communitarians was Brexit was a big turning point, a sort of post-liberal moment where lots of people were getting really frustrated with liberal attitudes. Again, all the evidence I've seen is that all generations, particularly younger generations, progressively are becoming more socially liberal on things like relationships, on race, on marriage, also on immigration. So the danger for the Conservative Party is that, and we've seen this in terms of the data on younger people, millennials in particular, are not turning to the right, are not going towards the Conservatives in the UK or the Republicans in the US as they get older. I think that's for two reasons, one of which is economic circumstances. It's just really difficult to buy a house, to start a family. So National Conservatives have a bit of a point, actually, in terms of the birth rate coming down. Yeah. And there's some material circumstances. But the crucial point is, I think, culturally as well, I think there's a sort of mismatch between younger people's values and what they see from some centre-right parties who think liberalism has gone too far. And I don't think that's just a kind of young person thing. I think most generations have become more socially liberal, and the danger for the Conservative Party is it starts to become reactionary to mainstream values, mainstream public opinion, rather than rooted in mainstream public opinion, which is what conservatism should be about. So, yeah, I think, we need to be conscious, I think, the Tory party in the long term, of just how much young people are turning away from centre-right ideas. And again, I think it's a material thing, but also culturally, in the sense that, a lot of millennials now, particularly women, nearly half of the cohort went to university. And there's a big correlation between going to university and holding more socially liberal attitudes. So I think this is a real long-term problem for the Conservative Party and the right in America. It seems to be quite an Anglosphere phenomenon.
I think it's true that younger generations are tending towards the left, but that is because they're being locked out of the processes that turn their older generations rightwards. If they can't own homes, if they can't have children, they don't have a stake in society, then that's going to happen, almost by default. So actually, it's in the Tories' best interest, especially, this is the thing that we're talking about a lot, and it's what I think has crystallised the issue of immigration. I don't think that would be anywhere near as big an issue if we had enough houses and we were building infrastructure, if we were building nuclear power plants, reservoirs, all that sort of thing. If people couldn't see the physical manifestations of the shortages, then I don't think it would be so much of an issue. But you can turn those people further to the right. I'm not saying that they're all going to become very right-wing, but you can turn them centre-right if you give them the reasons to do so. I think it's a little bit defeatist, and I think a lot of people on the right of the party would agree with this. It's defeatist to just say, the future generations will all be socially liberal because that's the direction that things are trending in. That doesn't necessarily bear out in every country around the world. It certainly bears out in the Anglosphere right now, but the Anglosphere is not the rest of the world. In China, it certainly isn't the case that they're sort of turning ever more leftwards. If anything, it's going in the opposite direction. So that is why I think, again, there needs to be more bravery around centrists about saying, okay, right now we might be a little upset about things like stop and search or things like immigration or upsetting voters who don't want new houses built near them. Maybe what is needed is a sort of a more muscular conservatism where you say, right, well, you might not like it, but that's what we need, that's what your children need, and that's what your grandchildren need, so that's what we're going to do. And it might mean that they take a bit of a battering at the ballot box. Well, that's going to happen anyway at the next general election. So what is stopping them from doing that? You don't need to sort of let yourself be torn each way and the other, between Remainers and Brexiteers and quite right-wing people and people who are effectively Lib Dems. That doesn't need to be the case. It requires a reassertion. And I just think that right now that doesn't exist.
I mean, I would say, socially liberal values are often painted as kind of, radical intersectionalism or, kind of communal thinking and in sort of pitting groups against one another and this kind of big wokery. I think actually the socially liberal position of treating people as individuals rather than as members of groups, I think is different to that kind of radical left agenda, and Conservatives need to be aware of that. Just on the point that Benedict's making around, building more houses, increasing home ownership, allowing people to start families, which a lot of people desperately want to do but don't feel they have the financial security to do so. I agree with all of that. But even with that, there seems to be, lots of affluent millennials are also turning in great numbers away from the Conservative Party in the centre-right in the Anglosphere. So I think there is a cultural thing. It's not just a material thing.
How much of that turning away do you think is to do with what's happened over the last year, the sort of divisions and, the various scandals and just the kind of things that have plagued the Conservative Party for, during the last year? So obviously we're seeing, young people say, I can't afford housing, the Tories have taken that away from me, so I'm not going to vote for them. But those who have, got all that but are still turning away, why are they turning away? Is it the infighting? Is it this, marked shift to the left, to the right in terms of rhetoric, or is it something different?
Well, the evidence is quite clear that private incomes and public services have either stagnated or dropped in recent years. So there's little wonder that it's unsurprising why people are frustrated with the Conservatives. And go back to Benedict's point around competence being the main thing. I agree with that. And obviously in 2022, there was not a lot of competence with Partygate and then the mini budget. So that's obviously worsened perceptions towards the Conservative government. But I think also people are in a place where no longer are they saying, what's the Conservative government going to do for me now it's in power, looking forward? There's almost a kind of looking back where they say, well, they've been in power for 13 years. What have they achieved? And frankly, there has been some progress, I think, on education reform, particularly on reading, thanks to some phonics push from Nick Gibb. I would say free schools, academies, expansion of university places, been some progress on employment policy and environment policy. But overall, the big things in terms of tax levels, debt levels, economic growth, we've stagnated or gone backwards. And that's the facts. So that's why I think people are turning away from the Conservative government. That's the sort of bottom line. But, for younger people, I think we've seen this shift away from the centre-right for some time. It's obviously been worsened by recent events. And again, I think that's down to the kind of material and cultural circumstances.
We've seen quite a lot of Conservative MPs announce that they plan to step down at the next election. I wondered if either of you had a kind of reflection on that. Is that a reaction to this kind of shift in the party's, popularity, or this kind of shift in some of its policies? Or is it just an inevitability of 13 years in power and people wanting, to spend some time with their families? Go on, Benedict.
I don't think it's in the numbers that would make me think, good Lord, this is quite the exodus. I think, they are the majority in government. You get some people who have been doing it for a long time. Some people like Deanna Davison, who's only been in for one term, might be thinking, actually, that I've served a term, I've had this experience, it's not what's for me. Equally, people like Sajid Javid, who might just be thinking, well, I'm never going to be Prime Minister, so I might as well go and make some money. I don't want to sit in opposition. I don't think it yet sort of represents the great Tory brain drain. Not that I would necessarily say that there were too many brains to be drained. And ultimately, there are a few, not many, but a few that I kind of look at and I think, well, good riddance, frankly. There are far too many hangers-on, actually, on the backbenches and in government who are not very good. And all of this, I'm afraid, has to go back to how it is that CCHQ sort of runs itself and selects its candidates. Too much sort of greasy pole climbing, all that sort of thing. Too many just shouldn't be there in the first place. And really, what we're discussing here, the sort of the conversations that are being had, these different conferences, is about the future of the party. If actually you're just there to be an MP because it's respectable and all of that, you have no place actually in what is coming, because it's going to be very painful. And I don't think the party has the time or the space for hangers-on at this moment.
It feels that we're sort of towards the end of the kind of Tory period, and that makes sense why some people foresee that and are leaving. It does feel that there's quite a lot of the sort of average age in which people are leaving is a lot, particularly on the Tory side, a lot younger than what was previously. Benedict's talked about kind of how CCHQ do selection. I think there's a wider point about the attraction of politics for talented people. And I do worry about this because obviously it's very important, public life and the impact that it makes. But I think a lot of younger people, frankly, the pay, the conditions, the intrusion in your personal life, and just the slowness of change as well. It feels a lot of people looking at business, entrepreneurialism for making more of a difference and an impact. And I do, I haven't got a study which, accurately analyses the quality of MPs, but it does feel to me that talented people are looking elsewhere. And I worry about that. There are some very talented people like Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak, I think are genuinely quite top of class, very cognitively able. But, they come from very affluent backgrounds. They, either were born into that or made huge amounts of money, which gives them a financial security. And I do worry, going back to what we were saying, people in their 20s and 30s, it takes them much longer to get financial security. So a lot of them will just be put off from going into politics. In fact, actually, if I could predict something, the trend would be that, either fewer quality people are going into politics or they come in much later. Maybe that's not a bad thing, actually, that they come in when they've made a bit of money and got more security in their 50s. But we're seeing that a bit in the US, right, in terms of the age in which people are becoming president. And also to some extent, apart from Rishi, but, Starmer obviously had quite a long and successful career before he came into politics. And actually, that might be a good thing.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because people kind of complain when they look at these sort of career politicians and they say you've got no life experience. But then also, if you have people who've worked a long career and then come in much later, people will say, everyone's so old in Parliament. There's no one speaking for the young people, or we've got a class of lawyers or whatever. So it's a kind of slightly difficult balance, and I guess really it's somewhere between the two. You want a kind of happy medium.
Everyone's going to complain all the time about
everyone's going to complain.
We all love youthful exuberance, but if I've just sort of sat here and said there's a lack of sort of track record of being able to get jobs done in politics, well, I couldn't look at somebody who's had a career of 10 years doing something and then go, oh, this person's too grey. That simply I don't think would work. And ultimately, I think people sort of tend towards experience rather than youthful enthusiasm, because as much as you need that vitality, that brings mistakes. It brings, sort of quips and moments of going viral on social media where you say something very silly in the pub. That's always a threat, I think. And also, just to touch very quickly on, it's not a very nice job. The culture around Westminster itself, I think, just isn't very nice. The way that people do business, the sort of, the opaqueness of it, and then actually how people sort of treat each other within Westminster. I just think it's a place that a lot of people, especially if they've done work experience, fair enough if you're somebody who's come up as a sort of a staffer and you think, yeah, this is the job for me. Okay, if you've got the wherewithal to do that, fine. I think a lot of people would have that experience and then go, no, actually, this just doesn't seem like a very good route in life for my own mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've spoken a bit about housing as a kind of serious policy area that I think, if we, the Liberal Conservatives need to kind of consider and back and kind of, put front and centre if they want to keep kind of maintaining support. I wonder what other kind of policies, and maybe it's good to start with you, Ryan, because obviously you do a lot of kind of policy thinking in your job. What other kind of stuff do you want to see maybe in the next Conservative manifesto that you think would kind of help broaden your voter base?
Well, I think they need to focus on how you boost living standards, so private incomes, and how you improve public services. They are, I think, the pain points for the majority of people. And because there's not much to say positively about the economy, I've found that there's some kind of leaning in on cultural issues and stuff around immigration, which I just don't think will win people over. On housing, I mean, there's definitely an issue with undersupply, particularly in desirable parts of the country. And we need to build more houses. We build less compared to other countries. There's a whole mixture of reasons for that, but the kind of lack of consistency in the planning system from local authority to local authority, I think, is a major reason for that. There's also demand side issues around it as well. I mean, frankly, for first-time buyers, it's just become much harder to get a mortgage because of the stress tests that have been put in since the financial crisis. So there needs to be, a tilting in terms of taxation and mortgage products towards first-time buyers, a bias towards them. If you look at buy-to-let investment, for example, baby boomers, I think now 1 in 6 of them own a second home. And part of that, I think, is just of them being able to take advantage of low interest rates to borrow even more on a second home. And that's, they've managed to swoop in and get homes which traditionally would have gone to first-time buyers. They have instead bought them and rented those out to those people who would have been first-time buyers. So I definitely think housing is one of the big things for younger people in particular, and there needs to be much more radical ideas, particularly around taxation, but also kind of the mortgage market in that area. I think the other area definitely where there needs to be a lot more focus is around supporting families and helping people in their 30s in particular with the costs of raising a child, whether that's to do with childcare or it's to do with, that first year, the maternity leave. Maternity or paternity leave in this country is like 150 quid a week statutory amount. That is not enough for most people. Now, if you're working at Deloitte or KPMG, you have access to a nice occupational maternity leave where you paid 6 months at full pay. Most people in this country work in small businesses, and that small business is only giving you statutory maternity pay. So, and the impact, particularly on women, not exclusively, but particularly on women, of looking after children in those early days is really substantial. And of course, a lot of women now went to university, quite rightly, very ambitious about their career. And the impact of having children is very clear in the statistics. So I think there needs to be a lot more focus on helping families, housing, childcare. That, I think, needs to be the real focus of the Conservatives now.
Tories need to be pro-natal because you will nip a lot of the issues around complaints around immigration in the bud if you're making it easier for people who are sort of competing to get on the housing ladder, competing to have children, if you make it easier for them to have those houses and have those children. Also, though, we're thinking long-term here because realistically the next general election is gone. They're probably not going to come back for another 10 years. Long-term, with an aging population, you need to have more children. You cannot simply rely on importing people from other countries because that is a market as well. And we are not currently in the best situation to compete internationally to bring the brightest and best from the third world. And it's also not fair on developing nations to just strip mine them of their brightest and best talents. The other thing, though, it does relate to housing, and that is that I think planning laws in general need to be liberalised to a degree because it applies to things like agriculture and also to things like energy. And I think we've seen over the last 12 months, 18 months, the importance of having a lot more independence and self-sufficiency when it comes to producing energy. I think we need to recognise that we have sort of rushed to net zero nobly but slightly too fast. We can't pick up the shortfall. We need to invest in nuclear power plants to pick up that shortfall. And that will take 10 years, which is why we should have been doing it 10 years ago, but no time like the present. And things like the fact that this country experiences drought every year because we don't build enough reservoirs. That's unforgivable for a country that has the rainfall that we have. And, in a changing world, it's no longer unipolar, much more multipolar. We don't know who our friends are going to be. We don't know who the ascendant powers are going to be, although we can kind of guess, and whether or not they are friendly towards us. The country needs to be more resilient, actually. And, a lot of the unhappiness that you're seeing is as a result of things that are beyond the scope of the government to control. It can't decide whether or not Ukraine is invaded or Taiwan is invaded, but what you can do is reinforce the system so that when those things do happen, people aren't, priced out of markets for things. They don't see all of their pay packets evaporating into inflation. So long term, I think the government has got to say, we're looking out for you long term, not just what you want this general election. We have a strategy. That I think would bring a lot more confidence to voters, having now just experienced these sort of once-in-a-generation event, that when the next one comes along, and it might be sooner than people realise, there will be a plan in place to make it less hard than it was this time.
Just a final thing I would add as well. I mean, thinking about the kind of economic potential of the country and long-term prosperity, at the end of the day, what you need is to really incentivise talented young people who are going to start up businesses and work hard and build things. And we need to be an attractive place for those people. I personally think for economic reasons, but also fairness reasons, we can change the tax system much more radically to reward work, to lower taxation on employment, whether that's on the employee side or the employer side, and raise it much more on income that derives from assets, whether that's dividends or rent or even pensions. And there's an intergenerational aspect to that as well. So I don't buy this argument, which is being given by the government at the moment, which is either you cut taxes or you control inflation. I think that you can drastically reduce taxation on younger people and employment on those people working hard, becoming entrepreneurs, by funding those tax cuts. They're not unfunded tax cuts, they're funded tax cuts, by raising income tax and national insurance on some of the things that I mentioned, like pensions, rent, and dividends. I think there's a way of doing that so it's broadly fiscally neutral, but changes the incentives a lot more.
Very interesting. Thank you. Final question, very quick. Any predictions for who might be the next Conservative leader? And if you don't have a name, do you think they will be more on the kind of central ground or on the right?
When are we talking in the coming year? I know there's lots of turnover at the moment.
I think Kemi Badenoch is probably the safest money. I don't think that she's necessarily going to be leader, but if you were to sort of look at the milieu of options that you have, I'd say probably that's the one I'd go for. She carries the least amount of baggage and the right amount of potential without being dangerous enough to sort of creep up unannounced on the outside. That's the one that I would say is most likely at this moment in time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Rishi, I definitely think will go on to the election. The polling seems to suggest that they will lose and he'll step down. In that case, I think Kemi Badenoch, Suella will put their hat in the ring. I think Kemi is an interesting appeal to different parts of the party. So, sympathise with what Benedict is saying. I think there are some younger people coming through that you need to sort of watch out for as well. So there's people like Victoria Atkins, Lucy Fraser, Chris Philp. I think a lot of those people will probably try and put themselves forward. But of course it helps if you've been in cabinet and have that sort of high profile status. So yes, I think Kemi feels the sort of, and Tom Tugendhat possibly because he sort of represents more the sort of centrist wing. But I think Kemi is probably well positioned in terms of the different wings of the party. And Michael Gove is very much behind Kemi as well.
I was going to say it's all academic because Michael Gove will probably be in charge no matter who is actually leading the party.
It's always Gove in the end, isn't it? Thanks very much. Thanks for watching. Let us know what you think by leaving a comment below. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. That'll help other people to find it. We publish new videos several times a week, so subscribers to this channel will never miss an episode.